Good evening, everyone. I'm Susan Vita, the chief of the music division here at the library, and I'm truly delighted to welcome you to tonight's program, Finding Strayhorn, exploring the Billy Strayhorn collection at the Library of Congress. We were so thrilled when we got the Strayhorn collection, and sometimes it takes us a while to get to a new collection and get it processed and get a finding aid out. This was not the case with the Billy Strayhorn. We got right at it, and now it is fully processed. There is a finding aid, and I think that's online. Is that online? Yes. And so I invite you to take a look at it and come and actually use the materials that are in the collection. Today we have a very special panel and performance that celebrates the library's acquisition of the manuscripts and personal papers of a major figure in American music. We decided to say Finding Strayhorn because you can now find the complete record of the creative career of Billy Strayhorn here at the library from the early 1930s to his death in 1967. Tonight we are sharing the story of the Strayhorn papers and their journey to the Library of Congress. And to tell the story, we are pleased to have with us Billy Strayhorn's niece and nephew, which is really a treat. I'd like to introduce Elise Clairbout, president of Strayhorn Songs Incorporated, and Gregory A. Morris. Don't want to leave out his wife, Thelma Morris. If you've talked to her, you know that she's not to be denied. Dr. Morris has been the executor of the composer's estate for 50 years. The family has carefully preserved Strayhorn's papers, guided the administration of his estate, and burnished his musical legacy. And thank God we had them as guardians of this materials, because otherwise, who knows what would have happened to it. So thank you very, very much for your care. This is a remarkable opportunity for all of us who are Strayhorn fans in this room. We have a unique panel lineup that features the two top authorities on his music. David Hajdu, whose biography of the composer Lush Life charted new territory for Strayhorn scholarship. David, thank you for joining us. And Dr. Walter Vandeleer from the University of Amsterdam is the author of Something to Live For about the compositions, and he has produced significant jazz history projects, including a rediscovered Strayhorn recording series with the Dutch Jazz Orchestra. Thank you very much. Saxophonist Chris Potter holds the post of LC Jazz Scholar for 2018 and 2019. And he is here, and he's going to help us really enjoy the music in a little bit. So thank you very much. And finally, maybe the most important person in the room, even though you wouldn't have expected it, many of you in the room know Larry Applebaum, the music division's jazz curator, and we are so happy to have you tonight here, Larry. It's really so good to see him. I also wanted to acknowledge several other people this evening. Rochelle Clairbout, the composer's great niece. Where is she? She's gorgeous. There. Oh, she's all the way in the back there. Sunny Sumter and Willard Jenkins from the DC Jazz Fest. Are they here tonight? I'm not sure. Anyway. And Dan Logan, who is a wonderful friend of the library, who has very generously supported our jazz programming over the last 3 years. Dan, thank you so much. And let me also thank the Music Division's Chris Harton, who's over there, who's the archivist who has been overseeing the processing of the collection and the creation of the finding aid. And then also Senior Curator Ray White and Tom Barrick, who is our collections manager. So those 3 guys are really fabulous. Finally, I wanted to say that our conversation tonight is intended as an intriguing tease for an exciting 3-night Strayhorn tribute next spring. So get out your iPhones and your calendars and mark May 28th, 29th, and 30th, 2020. We will have a big band evening with Lauren Schoenberg from the National Jazz Museum of Harlan as the conductor. We will have films, panels, talks, and a concert featuring the Bill Charlap Quintet and Cecile McLaurin Salvant. So, May 28th, 29th, and 30th, 2020. And with that, I will turn it over to Larry, who is our moderator for the evening. And gentlemen and ladies, thank you very much for your, coming and sharing your information with us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. And thank you all for coming. It's a great pleasure to be here, to be back here, actually. I just want to say, first of all, for everybody who's up here, they represent and they've set a standard for how people deal with the legacy of a singular genius like Billy Strayhorn. First to Gregory and Alice for their responsibility in keeping the integrity of the collection intact since Billy passed in 1967. To David Haydoon for telling Strayhorn's compelling story with great skill and insight in his book Lush Life. To Walter Vandeleur for his detective work in organizing and analyzing the contents of the collection for his book Something to Live For. And to Chris Potter for representing what we think will be successive generations of musicians and performers who will continue to derive inspiration from Strayhorn's work. Lastly, to my colleagues in the Music Division for their professionalism in processing, preserving, and now providing access to this important collection. So before we begin our conversation, please welcome everyone and thank them. So Elise, I think you had something you wanted to say first.
Just some opening remarks. First, a very special appreciation to the Library of Congress. A very special appreciation for the Library of Congress and to Larry Applebaum, who was the person we met. He came to Phoenix a year ago to look at the collection, and it was a wonderful time we had sharing, and his enthusiasm and his knowledge about jazz in general and his knowledge about Billy Strayhorn. That was just a wonderful time that we had, and so it's so really great that you're here because you've been so important for this effort. And we are so proud and appreciative of the Library of Congress because this is the quintessential library. This is the elite but very important, most prestigious place that we could get Billy's works represented. It's not just about a commercial exploitation, it's about legacy. And legacy has been very important for us. And as we established our corporation, Billy Strayhorn Songs, it was the legacy, to build the legacy. So in that light, I just want to say a few words about my brother, Gregory Morris. He's had a wonderful golden anniversary 2 years ago because it was 50 years that he had been handling this legacy, and not only the copywriting of the music and that part, but also as Billy's executor, Billy told him himself that he wanted him to take care of his stuff. And, 50 years, and then maintaining and keeping a hold of every piece of paper that was out there, and that's very important, because at that time, Billy Strayhorn was not a household name, but he knew that what his uncle had done was extremely important, and his love and respect and honor for his uncle was of major importance. And he held on to those papers, for dear life. He really did. He was very compulsive about it, because he understood the value and for love for his uncle, who he knew deserved to be recognized for his work. So, and as I said, this particular collection was very well organized. He did not just take papers and throw them together. It was very well organized. And as you'll understand, but hearing Walter Vanderloor talk about his work with the papers, but this effort was very thoughtful. 50 years, that's a long time to curate something. And it had to go to a place that was appropriate. And we had lots of offers, lots of looks at different places, but we are just very excited that here it has come here. We can't tell you how excited we are about it. Yeah, good. So, and as we said, this particular collection was very well organized when he got it, said James Wintle, the library's music reference specialist. It had been well taken care of. So that says something. The other thing the collection says is how Billy Strayhorn, what he thought of his craft. He kept things he wrote before he met Duke Ellington. There are things that he wrote when he was very young. He had wonderful mentors, wonderful teachers. He had a life. He was fully formed before he met Duke Ellington. But most people know him as being associated with Duke Ellington. Of course, Duke Ellington was a giant and probably represented, the major part of the jazz world. And to work for Duke Ellington was just no small thing. That was definitely very important. But when you look at him before Duke Ellington, he had already written a play that had been produced. He had already written some classical pieces. He did arranging for big bands. He had wrote his most song, Lush Life, when he was a teenager, both lyrics and music, very complicated. And there's a factoid I'm going to share with you. A lot of people have said over the years, well, if it wasn't for Duke Ellington, Billy Strayhorn would never have done anything. But Lush Life was never performed by Duke Ellington. It was never performed, nor was it part of the book. That song made it on its own merit. He said, so it really shows the real genius of Duke Ellington, of Billy Strayhorn's writing. And Duke Ellington knew it as well. So I just wanted to just make sure that that was clear, and also to let you know that our work with David Haydu and Walter Vanderloor has been a great experience. We call them kind of I want to just talk about the 90s so you understand why Billy Strayhorn's songs came to be. It was a pivotal decade for the legacy of Billy Strayhorn in a very unexpected way. The Duke Ellington collection was acquired by the Smithsonian in 1991. This sparked great enthusiasm by the jazz community to finally peek inside the Ellington oeuvre. The late Gunther Schuller once said that at an Ellington conference that the greatest musical tragedy of the 20th century was the lack of access to any of Ellington's scores for performance and study. During his lifetime, Duke Ellington was essentially the sole interpreter of his major works. He didn't actually publish his scores or release them for anyone else to use as by habit. So, but in the 90s, the other thing that was happening is there were a lot of the Ellington fans fueled by this enthusiasm of learning more about Ellington, who were preparing for the 1999 centennial of Duke Ellington during that decade. And in preparation of that, the goal was to make Ellington the most important composer of the 20th century. And so the Smithsonian was the key to that revival. But as a consequence, a lot of reissues of Ellington Strayhorn materials left Strayhorn out and maybe even his picture and replaced them with as part of that process. But even so, I have to switch to this now. Even so, even though that happened, the enthusiasm, the enthusiasm still had, the activity in the Ellington archive still had an aperture that had a light that came out to curious scholars who might not have been informed about Billy Strayhorn, who, as a result of being exposed to that, got involved and interested in Billy Strayhorn. And I know Walter was one of those people. And David had discovered Billy Strayhorn and studied him as well. And their works are watershed works that are part of what we call the revisionist renaissance, in a way, of the legacy of Billy Strayhorn. Then later in the 90s, we as a family decided to come together and form a corporation because Gregory, as executor, was able to recapture the publishing that had long belonged to Temple Music. And we said, well, I don't know, we can't do any worse, you know, in terms of, it was a risk. It was a risk, you know. I mean, we're not publishers, we're all educators, you know, but we said, well, let's do that. We might as well. So when we got the rights, and we're sitting there with the rights, we said, now that we have the rights, what do we do with them? So we engaged a co-publisher who was in the business of publishing. The first one was DreamWorks Publishing with Spielberg, Katzenberg, and Geffen. And now we currently engage Reservoir Media in New York, which is a young and very energetic and creative co-publisher, and they actually administer the catalog for us. And we, as a group in Billy Strayhorn Songs, which is, our board is composed of all family members, and we think of the ideas and we work hard. We work hard. We have a great repository of everything that's ever happened. Gregory was the founding president, and led us on this effort. And so, so we've been in business now 20 years. I think it's 20 years now, about. Yeah, 1998. So it's 21 years. And we have a wonderful foundation where we're working with kids in schools, and we did the educational conferences every year. And so what we find now is there is a tsunami of interest in the next generation. It's amazing how many young people there are who are interested in the legacy. But the books, much like, and I'll let David and Walter tell you their stories about their experiences, but we needed to acknowledge them because they're kind of like part of the family as well. So with that, I just wanted to say our purpose was to build legacy. We wanted to recapture the songs, preserve the catalog, manage and expand. That has been the philosophy of our corporation, and we have also educated our kids, who are now starting to come in and take over for this legacy. So it has a future. Now, are there any words you'd like to add to that? Amen. I have to defer to the king here.
You can see that I have been blessed with beautiful company by virtue of Elise Clairval and all the other members of the Strayhorn family, because we didn't do things in isolation. We got together, we talked, we shared organization. We were a family corporation, and we tried to share and gather ideas from everyone. But we also had to have a level of expertise to make certain that things happen the way we should. And you can tell by this young lady sitting on my right that we definitely had that kind of expertise and leadership to keep things moving. It was vital. And of course, I realized that I was driven by a promise. Because before Billy Strayhorn died, he had a meeting with me, a soul meeting. I have something that I need you to do. And I thought, what in the H could I do for Billy Strayhorn, given everything that he had going for him?
Tell him how old you were. How old were you then?
30 years old when he passed. Not knowing much about music and all that had entailed. But I remembered a few simple things. My first tuition payment to attend the University of Pittsburgh was made by Billy Strayhorn. He started me in my educational career. And I didn't know how else to pay him back other than to, what is it that you would have me do? And he told me, take care of my
stuff.
stuff. I cleaned that up. So I spent a lifetime, I guess it's been 50 years of doing it, just that. Going to court, spending the time, doing whatever needed to be. I had great support of sisters, brothers, everyone in the family. Wife, very understanding. We were in court several times, but we did prevail. And I would certainly say it was not an easy course, but it was one that was certainly worthwhile. Being here this afternoon certainly attests to the fact that it was all worthwhile, and it continues to pay off for us, because Billy Strayhorn was a genius in his own right, and everyone knows that. It's documented, and it continues to grow. So it was a great opportunity for me, and I thank all those members of the family who stood by me, helped me, pushed me, and if needed be, gave me a split kick, and you know where, to make certain that all that needed to be done is done.
Well, it's an honor to be with this group of my favorite people here to celebrate my favorite American artists. And it's fitting, too, that Strayhorn's materials should be at the quintessential library, to use Elisa's terms, because the library was so important to him. Now, my methodology when I was working on my book for all those years was a combination of archival research, drawing from this archive and other archives, and also doing firsthand interviews with the witnesses of Strayhorn's life. So I spent most of my time finding the people who knew Strayhorn and constructing the story of his life from their testimony, because so much of his story was lost to history and was undocumented. So one of the things I did was go through his grade school yearbooks, write down a list of the names, and call everyone who he went to grade school with. And one of those people that went to 5th grade with Strayhorn and knew him when he was 10 was a fellow by the name of Harry Herforth, who then went on to become the first chair trumpeter for the Cleveland Symphony. So I asked Mr. Herforth a number of questions, and chief among the objects of my curiosity was how Strayhorn became Billy Strayhorn. A poor kid, it's nearly impossible to grasp how difficult the circumstances of his upbringing were. Abject poverty, a rough household, and yet he became this highly sophisticated intellectual at a young age. He was writing very advanced music by the time he was in high school. I asked Mr. Herforth, could you explain Billy Strayhorn for me? He said, oh, it was the library. He said, after school, all the other kids were running around, playing ball, chasing girls, doing whatever they do. Strayhorn headed straight to the library. And he constructed like, a life for himself there, and nurtured the life of the mind. And he read without a tutor, in a self-directed kind of way, and he was always self-directed, and this archive shows that in many, many ways. And he became himself in the library, and I think it's fitting that now his legacy is contained here in the quintessential library.
So I knew they were going to do that to me. What else is there to say after all these great words? But you know what? I decided to play a clip.
That's cheating.
I know, it is cheating. I'll do it anyway. To give you an idea of the kind of music Billy Strayhorn wrote when he was young in Pittsburgh, when he came back from the library probably, and had spent some time studying composers that were not jazz composers and who he had a lot of knowledge of. Can I safely hook this up? Where is our? There you go. No. This is one of the pieces I found on those fantastic days I spent in the basement at the Morris residence in Pittsburgh, where they so kindly invited me to come over, and as I describe it to my musicology friends, it is as if you are in some basement in Germany and you stumble upon Beethoven 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. You know, the TV crews would be lining up around the block, right? Well, that's what happened to me. I found so much music there that I had no knowledge of, that was never recorded, that Strayhorn did not speak of, because apparently to him it was just common. This is one of those pieces that is not jazz, and at the same time has a lot of jazz in it. It's a little waltz he wrote. Probably when he was 14, 15, or 16, we don't know exactly. Do you have sound on the audio here? Yes? Yeah? Okay. Definitely the wrong one. my students, I would ask you why this piece, to a certain degree, sums up a lot of what makes Strayhorn's music. And if I had instructed you well, you would have said, well, one of the things that is very striking about this piece, apart from the beautiful melodies, the great form it has. If you notice, it is in a 3-part form. It's like an A section, what we call it, and then he moves into a different key in a very sophisticated way. We were nodding at each other like, oh, you know. That's far from home. How do you get back? But he gets back. And then he repeats the initial theme, but now with a little counter melody. It's all very smartly done. And that is, if you listen to all of Strayhorn's music, it always has this great balance and form, beautiful expressed ideas and melodies, and that's all there. At first I thought, oh, he copied some Chopin piece, right by hand. And then when you listen again, you're like, nah, Chopin never wrote something like that, you know, because there's some very, very Gershwin moments in there as well, you know. Chopin was not with Gershwin. What if you were to see the original score, you would also notice that there is Italian markings in there, Italian language. Like towards the end, it says perdendosi, which means dying out. That's really not your typical musical term, you know. It's not allegro or moderato. It's really something that. So it is one of those little gems. It's two pieces of paper that he wrote this on very securely. We were looking at this afternoon, Chris and I, at how secure his hand is, and you can see it there as well. You know, he knows what he's going to write, and this is just one of the sheets in the 4 bankers boxes full of music. I remember the first night at 11 o'clock, they came down. It's about time you eat something or drink something, because it was like a little Garden of Eden for someone who's interested in music. So, play some music, man.
All right, yes, so, oh, sorry.
Just one little note. And one of the things Walter did is he helped in organizing the music in creating a finding aid, which helped us, really understand. It helped us identify and bring some organization to these very disparate pieces. So that was a very important task. That's how familiar he had become with his catalog. So we really appreciate it. Anyway, I'm sorry.
Can I add a point about that piece of music?
His music teacher in 8th grade heard that and actually mistook it for Chopin. The music teacher would ask Strayhorn sometimes in 8th grade to teach the class.
I'd like to try to find a way to bring Chris into this conversation. If you can tell us which Strayhorn pieces tell the most interesting musical stories for you.
I wouldn't even know where to begin. They all was I've been spending the last 2 days here going through this archive and looking at score after score and just revelation after revelation. It's it's like reading Genesis in Moses' handwriting or something. It's like, wow, that's what it was. That's what. I think I speak for a lot of jazz musicians. I mean, for all of us, I hope. I mean, when we think of the pantheon of all the the folks on the highest level, there's sort of a special golden haze around Billy Strayhorn's name, I think, and I remember that, I think one of the first tunes that I learned when I started playing the saxophone when I was 10 was Take the A Train, and I remember very vividly listening to public radio, and they played the Queen Suite, the whole thing in its entirety. And it was, you know, it was during that. This is 1981. You know, I was a kid in Columbia, South Carolina, and I had a blank cassette tape, and you could record from the radio onto your cassette tape. So I recorded that and listened to that over and over and over again. And that was, you know, that was right at the beginning of, you know, just a very special relationship that I've always felt with Duke Ellington's music and the sound of Johnny Hodges and the sound of Paul Gonsalves and the sound of Eric Carney and Cootie Williams and Juan Tizol and on, you know, the voices that made that music speak. And early on, I got the message that, you know, Strayhorn was a big reason that the band had that sound. I mean, now going through the archive and seeing very specifically what that meant is, I mean, I can't say it's surprising, you know, being familiar with, you know, his style and his way of thinking, but it just brings it into sharper focus. What a huge part of that sound was, you know, Strayhorn, and it's just a remarkable thing to think that all these people found each other and worked together, and that, you know, he could write a ballad, an incredibly heartbreaking, beautiful ballad, and have Johnny Hodges play the melody, you know, and it's recorded, and we can still listen to it. I mean, it's you know, it's an amazing thing. But I think I will stop using words, and there's a big metal tube I'm going to try and It's so easy to look at how to play this music solo, and it's so rich harmonically. See what I can do. That's actually one of the reasons that I think I'm going to stick to some stuff that maybe that also kind of shows a portrait of his life in a way. He started with Lush Life, somehow get into Take the A Train. What I believe was the last thing he ever wrote. What was the original name for it? It was North Cloud. It was North Cloud, which became North by North. I don't know, but it's yes. Something that I was realizing today as I was preparing to play it is that the first three notes of Slow Town are the same first three notes as the tune he had written years and years earlier, entitled All Too Soon, which I'm not sure if that was intentional, but I'm sure as he was facing, you know, his mortality, I'm sure that's fine. And so there we go.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Beauty is a rare thing. So I have some specific questions I'd like to address to our all-star panel. And first of all, to David, if you could help set the scene for how and when did Ellington first meet Strayhorn?
Oh, boy. Okay. Strayhorn, okay, I'm gonna set the scene for setting the scene by saying that when I started my research in the late 1980s, I subscribed to the same misconceptions about Billy Strayhorn that most of the world subscribed to. That is that he was a brilliant arranger who composed a fairly small number of wonderful pieces, but was distinguished mostly for his invaluable assistance to Duke Ellington. I had no idea yet that the depth or the range of his accomplishments, and that came with time. This is in the mid-1980s, 86, 87 when I started. So every point of the 11 years of research, this book was a revelation. One of the revelations was that Strayhorn, as Elise said, which I did not know, and very few people knew, was fully formed as a musician before he met Duke. So it's not that the clouds parted, God, the light came down and united these two, and there that was destiny. Strayhorn had composed fantastic rhythm. He had a swinging little trio that he had performed all around the Pittsburgh area. And in the band book for the trio was Something to Live For, Your Love Has Faded, and a sketch of Lush Life that he was working on already. It's in the band book. He had arranged for a number of bands in the Pittsburgh area, in Western Pennsylvania. It's full arrangements. One of those pieces was called Smoky City, which later became better known as Smada, which is on his mother named him Bill, the great tribute record. So Strayhorn was fully formed. Very few people yet knew of his genius, but one of them was a co-worker at the drugstore where he worked, called Penfield Drugs. His co-worker's name was George Greenlee. George Greenlee had an uncle named Gus Greenlee. Any fans of African American culture in the mid-20th century or of the Negro Leagues would know that Gus Greenlee owned the Pittsburgh Crawfords. And also the property upon which the ballpark for the Crawford, the property of where the ballpark stood for the Crawford. And also two nightclubs in town, the Crawford Grill and the Crawford Grill 2. So George Greenlee, and I know this story directly from George Greenlee. I found him in a hospital. It's a great story about how I found George Greenlee. I'll tell you afterward, after a glass or two of wine. George Greenlee said, Billy, my uncle knows some people in the show business through the nightclub he owns. Would you be interested in meeting, one of these jazz people who comes through? So Strayhorn said, well, that would be very nice. So George Greenlee arranged for Billy to meet the next band leader who was coming through, who was Duke Ellington. And George Greenlee said to me, well, it's a good thing he could make it that weekend because Basie was coming the next week. I would have introduced him to Basie. And I think he would have been great with Basie, and he would have done fabulous work for Basie too. So, end of story is this. Did anybody see Strayhorn's name on Jeopardy last week? There was a question in Jeopardy. According to one account, this song was named for directions the composer was given, that Billy Strayhorn was given to Duke Ellington's house. I thought, one account? It's my book. Who did I mean, my kid's watching Jeopardy, throw me a bone. So Strayhorn met Duke Ellington. There's a a whole series of events by which Strayhorn demonstrated to Ellington how advanced he was as a composer and a lyricist and a pianist, all in one meeting backstage at the Stanley Theater in Stanley Theater in Pittsburgh. They met him a few more times. It is a whole set of certain things that go on over several days, and at the end of that, Duke Ellington said to Billy Strayhorn, "Come to New York. I think I may have a place for you in my organization." And he wrote down subway directions for Strayhorn to get there. Strayhorn went back and he told several of his friends, two of which I interviewed, "I have a great idea. I'm going to take Duke's subway instructions and set them to music." Anybody know how to get to Sugar Hill in Harlem? You take the H. That's the story.
So Walter, I know you've studied the working dynamic between Duke and Billy. When you're analyzing the music, how do you determine who wrote what?
Let me copy my partner here. Oh boy. Actually, it is not so difficult, but you know where to look. And I think that's what has confused people a lot. So the reason why people couldn't tell the difference between Ellington and Strayhorn was simply because they didn't know who Ellington and who Strayhorn was in the whole output of the orchestra, because it was never clearly credited. So there were pieces that were by Strayhorn and that, you know, did not have his name on them. There were arrangements that were usually not credited to an arranger. So when there was a piece that had Strayhorn's name on it, people would say, "Oh, hey, that sounds a lot like these other Ellington pieces." In fact, I ran into more than one occasion of work from co-musicologists who analyzed Ellington's genius but chosen the work by Strayhorn. So that was painful, but they couldn't know, because the only thing they had to go by were recordings, and we have to view the Ellington organization as a brand. And so, you know, this was Ellington, and that meant everybody who was working for that orchestra. And I think that Strayhorn, to a certain degree, understood that as well. So how do you tell the difference? Yeah, I gave some hints when I played that little waltz, because Strayhorn is someone who has a very classical sense of musical form. Who listens for musical form when they listen to a song? Not many people. So that's why they were looking for the particular chord or the particular, you know, moment in a piece of music. There's not a single chord that Strayhorn used that Ellington didn't use, or the other way around. You know, it's not on that scale. But if you look at the larger picture, then form is one of the things to look at. But you know, a lot of people are understandably not trained to think about musical form. So that's not something that gives itself away easily. If you hear in a Strayhorn and Ellington, the majority of their work was direct orchestral pieces. So a lot of the pieces do not live in first a simple piano version, which was then transposed to the orchestra. We were looking at it this afternoon. They were written directly for the orchestra with that whole orchestral sound in mind. That was why you said it's difficult to play this music without that whole background, right? So, and when Strayhorn writes for the orchestra, there's a lot more going on than the melody and chords. There's all kinds of other melodic phrases and movements. If you hear things come back, if you hear things that are echoed later on, if you hear something in an introduction that is developed somewhere in a part where they are moving into, you know, like a vocal part or something, those are the classical techniques, and that's what you hear with Strayhorn. Ellington used hard cuts. like what you do in film. You know, you cut the film and you go to a next scene, hard cuts. That's an old ragtime technique. That is contrast. You do something low on the keyboard, you know, that's great, sounds good, and then you go all the way up on the keyboard, do something different. You know, it's not worse or better, it's different, but it's a different technique. And you see it in Ellington scores as well, because Ellington scores can be made up of a piece of paper he had lying around with something he'd written a couple of weeks ago, something he's developing now, and then after the rehearsal he decides he needs an insert here and he calls it X, and then that goes in there. And that's what makes these parts sometimes hard to negotiate. You can only do that if you are working in these much more, hard cut forms. As I always say, in an Ellington score, you can draw the double lines. In music, where when a section is closed, you have a double line, a double bar line. And in Ellington, you hear them come by, like, wham, idea over, other brilliant idea, brilliant idea over, next brilliant idea, just like these ragtime pianists. Strayhorn is much more about integrated, larger arches, and that's a different formal aspect. That's just one of the answers. The rest is in my book.
So let me toss this out for anybody who wants to take hold of this. To what extent did Billy's private life impact his professional life?
And to what extent did
his private life impact his professional life?
The myths that have been developed, or that because he was gay in a time of a very male-dominated environment, that he needed protection from Duke, and that Duke was a shield for him. If you're talking about how his private life impacted, I differ with that particular theory for different reasons, because he was not secretive about his private life. He was very open about it. So I didn't understand why he could be open about his private life and secretive about his genius. That was a myth that never made any sense to me, but it is a common one. I do know that one of the things, I don't know if it was his private life or not, but you have to remember that Duke Ellington, we call Duke Ellington and Billy Strayhorn a collaboration. But when one of the partners is the owner of the orchestra, the owner of the publishing company, the senior member of the group, that's not a collaboration, that's an organizational. I mean, Billy Strayhorn was part of the Ellington organization. Ellington was the Ellington organization. And I think that power imbalance affected his career, because when you're a publisher, you have the publisher is the top at that time of the musical food chain. It was top of the ecology. The publishers determine what gets played, what gets published, and copyright registrations all went through the publisher. So it's like I saw this rerun of Andy Griffith where he was talking about this woman speeder. She said she came to the sheriff's office. She said, "I want to protest," and he's saying, "Well, you got to pay the fine." Then she said, "Well, I want to see the justice of the peace." So he goes and he turns his sign around and says, "Justice of the peace." I mean, he was wearing so many different hats and had an imbalance. So I don't think that what affected Billy's life was his personal life. I don't think it was. I just think that the collaboration was, they had uneven powers in terms of their powers. So that's my opinion.
I have another answer, which is not a disagreement with yours, but I understand the question a bit differently. I've been working on Strayhorn's music for half a year or so before I met David, maybe longer.
And I was working on his life for 5 years before.
Yes, right. And the thing that struck me in the music of Billy Strayhorn was that it had so many layers, and that there was so many depth to it, and even the most beautiful, gracious melodies can have very complex and dissonant chords under them, which struck me as remarkable. And then I learned about his life, and then it all made sense.
They could, right. Well, this is a very complicated question. Some of the pieces involve the business decisions that he made and the decisions Strayhorn made about how public to be, how prominent to be in the public eye. He was never secretive about his homosexuality at all. He was, which is a staggering thing about him for a figure from his time. But he had to make constant decisions about how public to be. Did that mean he should be in front of a band, do TV interviews, to be a public figure in the way that Duke was? So it gets very complicated. Another set of things which gets closer to the realm that Walter's talking about is the aesthetic realm. And this is even more complicated because to some degree it's legitimate to identify, appreciate, applaud what some would describe as a gay sensibility in his work. A sensitivity, bittersweet quality, arch sense of humor sometimes, a wit, a sophistication, an elegance, attention to beauty, absorption with the natural world. There's not so much machismo or bravura. It's not so much of that boy meets girl, not just boy meets girl, but boys going after the girl, and that boy's gonna get the girl no matter what. There's not that kind of, competitive male thing, but that doesn't mean it's female, doesn't mean it's gay. It's very complicated. You have to be careful not to fall into a bunch of gay stereotypes or gay tropes. You have to be very, very careful. But that doesn't mean at the same time you can't genuinely be attentive to what constitutes the gay sensibility in there. But like I said, it's complicated.
Yeah, I was also thinking about his, what I understand as a troubled childhood, from which he probably grew up with a bunch of traumas or something along those lines. I've never known him personally, so, but that seems to be something that is in that music. That is, that's what I meant with the layers and how even things that sound very beautiful and graceful still can have this sort of darker, deeper, tension. Maybe that's the word, tension. A lot of tension in chords and melodies and lines, and that I somehow associate with part of where he came from. I think that is. But it's dangerous because, some people lead happy lives and, direct really dark films, or the other way around.
But
what all this has in common is the truth in his music, and that he never lies in his music. There's never a false front in his music. There's never a phony show in his music. It all comes from within. Whatever the dimensions it have, you just feel palpably that it's true to his spirit.
Yeah.
But as a practical matter, however, there were issues regarding the collaboration. For example, when Frank Sinatra went in and tried to sing Lush Life, he wanted to record it, and he was not able to sing that bridge. And he said, we'll have to put this off for next year or something like that. And he wanted to hire Billy Strayhorn, and Duke had the power to stop that. He also was offered a job as an assistant musician for MGM. He couldn't go there. So there were some opportunities. He was also very frustrated with the accreditation of the Carnegie Hall concerts. That, you know, so, but here where his personal life directly impacted his career was probably in the person of Joe Morgan, who was Duke Ellington's publicist, and he was homophobic. And he was the one who was the engine behind scratching names off and taking stuff. You can talk about that, Greg, because you know about that matter.
Elmer's waving me off.
Oh, no, okay. We have to protect him. But, I mean, and so when I understood his personal life impacting, I was looking at more some of the practical things in terms of the pathway of his career. I appreciate the sophisticated, you know, the music, and I do think there was something like that, because if you listen to his music, it's very melancholy. He has a lot of melancholy, and just to write a song called "I Want Something to Live For," you know, it's very melancholy, and there was a lot of that dark, you know, passion flower, even something like that, and that probably did. I think that his music scored his own life, and his music was an expression of who he was, you know, and that and he had a deep sadness, I believe, that was just ever present. And I think you're right, and it was reflected, and very well put, that it was reflected in. And I think Ellington had a lot of sensibilities. You know, he knew the score. You know, he was. And if you think of Duke Ellington, he was more enigmatic than Billy Strayhorn was. Because if you ask somebody, well, who was Ellington's best friends? There's very little you know about him personally. But it was very interesting that Ellington described Billy Strayhorn as the eyes in the back of my head, my writing and arranging companion, my right arm, my left arm. And that chemistry between the two of them on that personal level, he let Billy in ways that he never let anybody else in, according to his granddaughter, Mercedes. And she said there were two people that Ellington loved, his mother and Billy Strayhorn. So he had a greater intimacy intellectually with Billy Strayhorn than he had with all his girlfriends. Any of his girlfriends, none of whom he ever married. I mean, I don't know.
That's what I said. No, I wanted to know. But
I just think that's an important issue in terms of understanding his personal life and how it affects his.
I speak for both of us. I want to add to that and point out, speaking of like dangerous lines of thought, you know,
Okay.
like minefields and lines of thought. I think there's a hazard in measuring Strayhorn's greatness by his importance to Duke Ellington. So,
Yes.
you know, like Duke would say this often, and this is a way of, I think, of passive aggressively diminishing Strayhorn. You know, Strayhorn is the eyes of my body. He is all that I am. That's still defining his value through Duke, and that's really problematic.
That's very interesting.
I mean, again, I didn't know him, I wasn't around, but I'm just thinking of being in that situation, just imagining it for myself. I mean, you know, there were big advantages for Strayhorn to stick around on a variety of levels. I mean, one is that I mentioned, you know, he could write for Johnny Hodges. I mean, that's not an insignificant thing, you know. And if he had been a staff arranger at NBC, or something, you know, it would have been great, but he wouldn't have had that. I think on a personal level, I mean, you know, not thinking of Ellington as so much as Shield, but from what I know of the situation, for better or worse, it was kind of a family. You know, he was accepted. All the members of the band. It was kind of where he maybe felt some sense of belonging. I don't know. You know, and he could be who he was, and everyone seemed to accept him. I mean, it wasn't just that Duke accepted it; it was that the whole band loved him. You know.
Not just accepted, they loved him.
They like really loved him. He was you know, he was kind of in his element in a certain way. On the other hand, he was obviously artistically frustrated. You know, there were a lot of things that I'm sure he wished he would have been able to do, and he didn't quite have the chance to do it, and he didn't get the credit, obviously. you know. And then there are probably a lot of musical projects he would have done if he hadn't been in that situation. But maybe in the end, you know, it was just worth it for him because of all the positives. You know, I don't know.
Yeah, and I really appreciate the comment about getting into minefields. Because like you said, it's complicated. It is very, very complicated. And, you know, the collaboration did yield a lot of great music. It really did. And it was probably the most important collaboration in jazz, in my opinion. And it was fruitful. It was fruitful. So anyway.
Maybe it's time to open this up for any questions that you might have. Surely you must. There's one right there.
I actually have a question and a comment to sort of add to.
We have 1 second, we need you. I'm sorry.
First of all, I want to thank all of you for being here. This has been a fabulous conversation, and thank you to the family for donating these materials so that we can use them. It's really going to be fabulous. My question is, another thing to think about is when you think about what Billy Strayhorn is coming of age, it really is when recordings take off. And it was the first time where you could really have a career as a musician without having to do the emotional labor of dealing with audiences, and that you could be in the recording and hall. And I'm wondering, are there any other ways, and I just don't know this, where you find Billy Strayhorn being aware of these new technologies, and are there ways that we find him using them in his composition?
Well, he was in charge of all the small group recordings, wasn't he? Yeah. And some of those records, because Duke was a big band. I mean, that was the large ensemble.
But I'm thinking like the long play records, like suddenly the recording is like at least more.
What do you think?
It's a good question, and I mean, I can ramble a bit about it. It's clear that for everybody, the longer format changed things. A lot of aspects to that. And also the whole technology changed the music field, and you know, rock and roll went to 45s and jazz went to LPs, and that changed the thing. Of course, the Ellington Band celebrated the advance of the LP, the long playing record, with a record called Masterpieces by Ellington, and it should be subtitled Arranged by Strayhorn, because it has Mood Indigo, Solitude, Sophisticated Lady, all arranged by Strayhorn in them. And they're long versions, like 12, 13-minute versions of those pieces, in which you could kind of stretch out and show, you know, what he could do in a longer format. But as a rule, they were most comfortable with pieces that were around, you know, 4 to 6, 7 minutes, which seems also, in terms of musical balance, to make sense. I don't feel with Strayhorn that he is ready to break out of that format and do longer things. It's not something that the music seems to ask for.
Again, if we take your question sociologically to mean that does recording make it possible for someone to have a life as a creative figure in music without being on the band, being on the bandstand and engaging with the public? Absolutely. He probably would have had a hard time at that time in cultural history being a public figure. He's just not inclined that way. He didn't have the way with an audience that Ellington did. It's not that he never performed. He did occasionally perform, but he just didn't have the gift. Duke had a profound gift for engaging with the public. He was a deeply gifted composer and a deeply gifted showman.
Who else has a question? Yeah, go ahead. Right there in the back.
Just a question about this kind of irony of how late it's been since Billy Strayhorn, his genius has been discovered, and and publicly commented on and put out there for so many of us kind of come to it late in our age and even late in American life. So if you contrast his kind of staggering genius as an artist in all those ways, contrasted with his very humble beginnings slash the kind of barriers that he had, a triple minority in various ways and all these sort of things. So just to observe you all, experts on him in various ways, struggle to articulate this kind of, I mean, what he really has achieved. Is it appropriate to, the only thing that comes to mind for me is how the, I mean, when you're in the realm of greatness, usually you're over-describing even genius. Here, you all are almost struggling to capture with the words that we're limited to. So the way that the Dalai Lama is chosen in China and Tibet, is it, here comes the question, sir. Thank you. Is it, I'm curious about this, and maybe you'll enjoy it too. That's so random, and it can be any person that's not formally trained, that's not, and then completely come out of nowhere as Strayhorn did. And yet it takes so long for us to catch up as a society to him. Is that an apt description of, I mean, how did he do this from where he came from and then achieve that level of artistry?
I wish we knew.
But he he was gifted, and he worked hard and applied himself to the life of the mind and to the creative mission, to the creative project, and to the craft of music, and to learning about music and mastering the craft of music from a very young age. And he worked at it very hard and put everything he had into it. So it's not, yes, he was a genius, but it's not quite that. It's a bafflement that, like one day he's playing basketball, and the next day he's writing Passion Flower. It's a continuity.
Well, and if I hear your question differently, why is it we've all been so unaware of him or not aware enough? I think it's also the human mind who likes to think in binaries. And we already knew that Duke Ellington was this genius, so that everybody else around him could not be the same genius or something, or rather, And frankly, I think we do not need to compare people and set them off against each other. And the question we're getting all the time is like, who do you like better? Which is a question I refuse to answer, because I have Mahler on my phone as well. and so it is to a certain degree that his light was crowded out by Ellington, but that was not because of that Ellington wanted that, but that's because how audiences like to think about that. And it's also been part of the nervousness of certain fans that now that we're giving someone else his due, that would take away, because it's as if there's only so much water in the bucket or something. I don't know.
Can I like to add a point to that? I think there's a degree of embedded racism in this attitude that the American culture would accommodate any number of white geniuses or white genius composers or white genius band leaders or white genius singers and musicians, but black geniuses, we have one. It's Duke Ellington. Yeah, that's done, check. So there's no room for another.
I was confronted by a cultural critic one time at a conference, and somebody pointed me out to him and said, that's Billy Strayhorn's niece. And he said, oh, really? And he's an Ellington fan. Okay. And he walked up to me and introduced himself to me, and somebody we all heard of, so I'm not going to say who it is, but he said, Now, he's meeting me for the first time, and he said, you know, Duke Ellington is this, and Billy Strayhorn is this. So I didn't get angry. I just said no. I said Duke Ellington is this, and Billy Strayhorn is this. And he was totally confused. But I think what I was saying was what Walter and David are saying. There's difference. All that is wide is not necessarily deep, and all that is narrow is not necessarily shallow. You see that? I mean, and it's a different way of looking at it. And he was so baffled by that because he thought, I'm gonna get her, you know. I'm gonna just lay this down on the line. And when I said that, he went, you know, he was baffled. But I think it is the truth, what they're saying, that there are material differences, but that's what made the collaboration so rich. Because they had that, they had a symbiosis of some sort that can't be analyzed because it was something there, so.
Unfortunately, we only have time for one more question, and it's back here.
Hello, I'll be really brief. I had a couple of questions. The first one is, just one question, sorry. The question is, could you talk a little bit about Billy Strayhorn's adaptation of the Lorca play, and if there's like any surviving script or anything like that? I'm very curious about that. And if you know there's any lyrics
I'll
to.
start. One thing I didn't realize until I was 5 years of my research is that Strayhorn and Ellington were estranged for a while. There were about 3 years when Strayhorn wrote nothing for Duke Ellington. He went off on his own and did a number of projects. Set up a collaboration with Luther Henderson to groom singers and acts, and also to write a musical drama called Rose-Colored Glasses. It was incomplete. And he set off with this group of abstract expressionists and off-Broadway artists in New York to write a play. There was an adaptation of Lorca called The Love of Don Philippin for Belisa in the Garden. Now, I knew about it first because I found a little news clip about it, and then I found the set designer, Alfred Leslie, abstract expressionist painter of some note, and he said the music was so beautiful, I still remember it. Now, this is not like 1991, so this is 40 years later. This performance had 3 performances. So he heard it 3 times 40 years ago. And he sang it for me, and I have it on the tape. Then the music is in the archive, and Walter will take over talking about the music, and it matches up. So it had that, it struck this person so deeply that he held it in his heart for 40 years. Wow. And it's not just that it's catchy, like, oh, you can remember Happy Birthday, but it's so deep.
So there are some scores left. We're not sure whether it's complete, but there are 3 songs, and 2 of them they sound like French art songs, something like that, with Poulenc-like piano accompaniment. We were just looking at it this afternoon.
It sounds very different than the rest of his.
Very different music, and it's stunning. It is really stunning, and there's also a piano solo piece which is a bit sketchy. But for him it was clearly enough to work from. And then there's a piece that ended up in the Ellington repertoire, which is called Wounded Love, which is a fabulous piece, but it's only been recorded with a small band. But there's a score for the full Duke Ellington Orchestra. It's one of the scores that never got recorded until a bunch of Dutch musicians decided. And I think those records are not available anymore, but they're probably on Spotify or YouTubeify or some other illegal outlet.
Yeah, it was an amazing work that Walter, how many performance scores did you develop? About 60?
Yeah, I think so. We did 4 CDs with about 12. So the waltz I played is from that, yes, from that collection as well. So we did 4 CDs with what we call newly discovered works, because they were not necessarily lost or gone, but we kind of refound them. And some of them were pieces that were known but in different versions, and some of them were completely original pieces. And also, oh yeah. I mean, it's so pointless to talk. I mean, we listen to it. Tonk is a piano piece that the Ellington fans will know. It's a 4-handed piano piece that Ellington and Strahan, Tonk, yeah, that Ellington and Strahan would play at parties. And would sit behind the piano keyboard, and they were both fantastic piano players. And so that's how we knew it, and it got recorded at some point with the two of them at the piano keyboard. And then while one of my nights in the basement in Pittsburgh, I found this 1940 score called Tonk. And turns out it's an orchestral piece with a solo piano part for a Duke Ellington. And Ellington had been writing solo concertos for his star soloists, but it was not a piano solo piece, and that's what Strahan set out to write. But the piano part was missing, because they never wrote out piano parts. They would teach each other piano parts. So I took the piano part from the recording. It fitted exactly into that score. And there were also some annotations in Ellington's hand on Strahan's score, piano kind of reminders like chord symbol here or there. And that, convinced me that Ellington was really, the assigned piano player in this Strahan piece. You should all listen to it, not listen to us.
I'd like to end by thanking everyone for coming, but especially for our panelists. Thank you so much. And then I will ask Chris to serenade us out with one last taste of Strahan.
And on a happy note.